Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. My name is Jocelyn Bell Burnell, and I'm the current president of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you all here this evening for a rather special evening. And it's my pleasure to introduce this evening's lecturer, Dr. Nathan Waddell. He's an assistant professor in the School of English at the University of Nottingham. He did a BA, MPhil and PhD degrees in English literature at the University of Birmingham. He's the editor of the Journal of Wyndham Lewis Studies. He sits on the editorial board of the collected works of Wyndham Lewis for Oxford University Press. And he is preparing a major study of Lewis's writings and politics for Princeton University Press. He's already written 2 books, Modern John Buchan, published by Cambridge Scholars in 2009, and Modernist Nowheres, published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2012. And he's edited several compilations of scholarly essays. And he says when he isn't reading, he's usually listening to Rachmaninoff. His talk is entitled Facing Beethoven, Literature, Sculpture and Identity. Would you please welcome Dr. Nathan Waddell?
Thank you very much for that introduction. And thank you very much for coming. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be talking about 2 subjects that I hold very close to my heart. I won't tell you which one I hold closer to my heart, music or literature. You'll have to work it out for yourself. But this convergence of material is very important to me. And I said a moment ago that I listen to a lot of Rachmaninoff. Doing this, I've listened to a lot of Beethoven. And that's been incredibly pleasurable and very, very, very instructive at the same time. But I'm a literature scholar by training. So this is literature focused. What might it mean to face Beethoven? There are several meanings here that we can explore. First off, we may want to look in the face of Beethoven, to try to get the measure of the man and the music by confronting him, either visually in relation to the many Beethovenian images that have been produced over the last 2 centuries, or perhaps more figuratively by trying to take the measure of Beethoven in some sense, to think about and to assess his significance. Another emphasis emerges from the meanings I've just intimated, the idea of giving a face to Beethoven. Again, either by inspecting the paintings and drawings and sculptures of him that have appeared throughout the years, or by trying to lay onto the idea of Beethoven some image of him and his work that satisfies whatever it is we want to say about or to find in his life and music. There's also a slightly more troubling idea of facing, and that is the form of facing that occurs when we show a brave or strong face to something, such as when we put on a brave face, during times of adversity or distress. There's a sense in which we must do this when facing Beethoven, for confronting Beethoven means confronting not only one particular composer at a particular moment in musical history, however rich and diverse his output, but rather the full and still unfolding totality of all that has been said and thought and written about Beethoven, which is considerable. Facing Beethoven entails a continual effacement, in other words, of everything that is not Beethoven, but which might be relevant to understanding him, in other words. And the problem, as is so often the case, is one of choice. In facing Beethoven, we have to face up to our own prejudices as to what is and what is not relevant. And in this respect, as ever, we must be cautious. As Wagner warned when discussing similar problems, with regard to the influence of purely personal impressions of life upon the choice and shaping of materials, we must form conclusions with the greatest circumspection. And all of this is undoubtedly true. Beethoven is probably the most familiar case of a life subjected to purely personal impressions. Hence the so-called Beethoven myth, that process by which we have come to know very particular versions of the man and the man as musician. Yet for the scholar K.M. Nissel, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, the problem is not so much that the myth exists or that it distorts certain historical truths, but rather that the myth itself is such a good one. Beethoven, the fiery genius, perhaps the greatest musical mind ever known, loses his hearing, the one sense a musician cannot do without. Yet somehow he perseveres, making his accomplishments that much greater for having originated in a life so filled with pain and sadness. We find Beethoven's ability to overcome his circumstances reassuring, for ultimately, are we not simply suckers for a happy ending? Now, the workings of that myth have followed many forms, and tonight I want to focus on a single material vector for it, the portrait sculpture of Beethoven, specifically in relation to literary representations of such objects. And the question, which I'm sure you've asked yourself already, is why? Why would you want to do this? This is a question I've asked myself on a number of occasions, but anyway, here we are. One answer to this question is that in studying how writers respond to sculpture, we can see how they assess the status of Beethoven as a cultural landmark. Not just as a figure of fame, though he was and is certainly that, but also as a sign of the tendency for fame to lead to other conditions. One such condition is the condition of ordinariness. It can be hard for us to think of Beethoven as ordinary, yet the very fact that everyone in this room most likely didn't need to be told who Beethoven was when they saw the advert for this talk speaks to a certain kind of ordinariness, to his by now all too familiar place in culture. Studying English literature specifically allows us to see how an icon of German art, in the broadest sense, influenced certain narrative choices in different national creative contexts. To study Anglo-German artistic relations at a particularly gritty level, in other words. Another reason to study literary depictions of Beethoven's sculptures is that they show how variously he figures in 19th and 20th century literature. And if working on Beethoven and literature has taught me anything, it's this simple yet highly troublesome fact. All writers from about 1830 onwards, seemingly, have a view about Beethoven. They all seem to have heard his music, they all seem to have an opinion about it, they all want to say something about it at some point. And that's not particularly surprising. We would expect so famous a figure to have more than his fair share of admirers and commentators, not to mention a sizable body of academic criticism devoted to his life and music. And so it goes. In the case of literary accounts of or responses to Beethoven, the problems come in knowing when they matter, when the accounts or responses are worth commenting on. Just because a writer mentions Beethoven doesn't mean that the mentioning is itself worth a mention. And as the critic David Trotter has put it, presence of some sort at a particular rhetorical or narrative conjecture or point in a text can matter a great deal and yet not symbolize. In the present context, we might put it another way. Beethoven obviously matters, but he doesn't always matter obviously. Consider, for example, the following extract from a letter between the New Zealand modernist writer Catherine Mansfield, most famous for her short stories, and the musician Garnet Trowell. At one point in the letter, which was written in September 1908, Mansfield notes, "I saw today such a fine picture of Beethoven. It would have appealed to you. I know the wind seemed to be in his hair, and he seemed to hear with his eyes, frowning so. There is a sublime simplicity in Beethoven, not in accord with the spirit of our times." Now, I should put my cards on the table at once. It's already been alluded to a little bit. I'm an editor at heart and a historicist by training, and that's to say a large part of my job involves editing other people's work. But I'm also now starting to edit certain literary works by writers from about 100 years ago. And a big part of that kind of editing, evidence of which you'll find in any Oxford World's Classics volume, for instance, or Penguin, concerns the links between a writer and the influence of history upon that writer's writing. And that's where the historicism come in, the historical awareness. I want to know where writers took their views from, why they wrote what they did, and what critics today can say about a given writer's place in the histories of their times. Now, the fact that Mansfield mentions the frown of Beethoven gives us some history to work with. The idea of Beethoven's scowl is largely a product of visual and rhetorical convention, of our shared accustoming, as the writer Romain Rolland described it, to what many have constructed as Beethoven's tragic face and imperious gesture. Those are Rolland's terms. The process began in earnest with the reception of the famous life mask of Beethoven taken by Franz Klein in 1812. This mask captures a face seemingly in the throes of artistic torment. That's the standard sort of critical view of this, at any rate. But appearances can be deceiving. In Klein's mask, what the philosopher Roland Barthes called the seething agitation of creativeness appears to be caught as a grimace. The truth is more clear-cut. Beethoven disliked the casting process. The expression shows the face of a man scowling because he is angry and uncomfortable and frightened. And even though the mask shows a man in torment not at the pains of creation, but at the created pain of enclosure, the myth has proved far more durable than the truth of the moment. Capturing the flicker of a grimace in Beethoven's face, a sign of his anxiety at the sensation of being confined in plaster, Klein's mask appeared to embody the lifelong strife of a composer who by 1900 would be installed as the ideal example of the artist figure struggling against an inevitable, inspiring fate. Hence Alessandro Comini's point that, and this is a quotation, subsequent image makers and musical interpreters, as different as Berlioz and Mahler, would seize upon the formidable impression of seriousness and intense concentration conveyed by Klein's austere life mask as indicators of the suffering and triumph in both the musical and personal character of Beethoven. We can discern those indicators in painted and sculpted portraits throughout the 19th century, ranging from famous works like Klein's bust of Beethoven, also made in 1812, and I'll show you that in a moment, and Ferdinand Georg Waldmüller's portrait of Beethoven, which is on CD covers everywhere, up to less well-known offerings like the studies of Beethoven created at the turn of the 20th century by Antoine Bourdelle, and Edward Steichen's Beethoven portrait, which, as Sidney Allen put it, though no canvas of colossal size, was almost Doric in its severity. There are even signs of a Beethovenian scowl in Gaudia Breschke's bust of Alfred Wallmark, which appears to allude to Bourdelle's sculptures. Now, a similarly severe Beethoven image appears in Leonello Balestrieri's prize-winning painting, Beethoven Kreutzer Sonata from 1900, which depicts two musicians performing to a group of bourgeois bohemians in a studio decorated with a sculpture at the very top that is easily identifiable as a copy of the Klein life mask specifically. And it may be that Wyndham Lewis had Balestrieri's painting in mind, or at the very least the kind of space it depicts, when he wrote his avant-garde modernist novel Tar, which was first published in 1918. In that book, different moments in the work are reminiscent of identifiable paintings. One such instance is the moment when the artist, Tar, the protagonist, draws his fiancée, Bertha, ungraciously and roughly into his arms and starts kissing her mouth with a machine action. Those are the words used. And this brings to mind works like Klimt's The Kiss. But the link with Balestrieri is augmented by the fact that Bertha keeps a Beethoven mask in her apartment. So we're starting to see little details in these texts that make you see where you might go with this. If you are starting to pay attention to these things or become obsessed with them, take your pick. So to return to Mansfield, it's worth noting that nowhere else in the letter, and it's a very short letter, this isn't all of it, but there's not much more, does she specify where she saw the Beethoven image or which image it was. Consequently, the first question that springs to mind is, what fine picture of Beethoven did Mansfield see? Another question is, can we, on the evidence given, triangulate a likely candidate for the image? Put another way, can we use our detective skills to work out, based on where she was at the time, the sorts of places she frequented at that time, and the likely venues available to her in those places at that time? Can we use those factors to pinpoint, to identify the image? And those questions, moreover, lead to a more fundamental matter, which might be more relevant. Does it matter whether we can or cannot identify which image is being referred to here? And I have a lot of sympathy for those, which may include everybody in this room, who would answer this last question with an abrupt no. But if you were trying to annotate this kind of passage for an interested reader in a scholarly edition, for instance, of Mansfield's letters, answering that sort of question, being posed with that sort of puzzle, might be one of the tasks by which you would be faced. Now, admittedly, this verges on some form of the pedantic, but if editing has taught me anything at all, it's that pedantry pays off, or that it can. It all depends on what you're trying to do. Now, two further examples in this context will help me show you what I mean. About halfway through H.G. Wells's novel Kipps, the eponymous protagonist, Artie Kipps, is exposed to a carefully calculated scenario after he rings the doorbell of the Kreutzer's house in Bouverie Square. A queer little maid with a big cap admitted Kipps and took him through a bead curtain and a door into a little drawing room with a black and gold piano, a glazed bookcase, a Moorish cosy corner, and a draped looking-glass overmantel, bright with Regent Street ornaments and photographs of various intellectual lights. A number of cards of invitation to meetings and the match list of a Band of Hope cricket club was stuck into the looking-glass frame, with Kreutzer's name as vice president. There was a bust of Beethoven over the bookcase, and the walls were thick with conscientiously executed but carelessly selected views in oil and watercolours and gilt frames. Now, Wells, I have to strike a note of caution here because this is usually what I would say to my students, now hang on, you're talking about Wells or the narrator. But I'm going to go with Wells, evidently wants us to know that the Kreutzers are not quite in control of the means with which they try to manipulate their cultured appearance. The reference to their carelessly selected pictures suggests as much, yet so do the indefinite articles in the list of ornaments with which Wells has his narrator evoke their sense of taste. The inclusion of a generic, and because generic, presumably imitation, Beethoven bust, a bust of Beethoven, indicates the ubiquity of such busts at the turn of the 20th century. It also suggests an indifference to whether such ubiquity matters, except as a sign of respectability. What matters here is the fact of having a Beethoven ornament rather than one Beethoven sculpture or reproduction of a sculpture over another. The nonchalant way Wells's narrator mentions the bust evidences its purpose as a cultural souvenir. To be seen to have such an ornament is really the only reason to have it, the ubiquity of the object turning attention away from its ordinariness, but not cancelling it. By the start of the First World War, so that was 1905, the bourgeois implications of Beethoven busts had become familiar to the point of being hackneyed. Wells's little-known novel The Wife of Sir Isaac Harman leaves unsaid how a Beethoven bust, which materializes Lady Harman's genuine appreciation of the composer, can be anything other than an ornament with which to beautify the aristocratic home. The Beethoven busts on mantelpieces and pianos in Wells's, again a very obscure text, Select Conversations with an Uncle, and Kate Chopin's more famous The Awakening, for instance, hark back to the Victorian literary convention of independent or rebellious women playing Beethoven's music as a form of socio-political resistance. Yet they also indicate the grip such sculptures had on the well-to-do and those who sought access to their ranks. And in Dorothy Richardson's Pilgrimage, the novel sequence Pilgrimage, this predicament gives rise to an ambiguous form of scorn. Honeycomb, the third novel in the sequence, suggests that the condition of not owning a Beethoven portrait bust disadvantageously marked London's suburbanites, who are mocked for their weakness and thoughtlessness, for their materialism, and above all for the fact that amongst their furniture, and this is the key line, they do not even have busts of Beethoven. And this lack is as much a problem as an opportunity, as much a sign of a suburban life devoid of expected refinement, as of the potential for such an absence to produce a more full and satisfying existence. So there's a lot being packed in other words, into these, what might, on a first reading, I would say, seem quite glancing references. Now, reproductions of Klein's mask and the portrait bust he derived from it, these were common objects in turn-of-the-century bourgeois Anglo-American and European households. Comini points out that, quote, the second half of the 19th century witnessed not only the widespread public familiarity with the composer's works, but also the rise of a Beethoven religion that caused his effigy, be it in plaster or in bronze, to become a common and even de rigueur house god. And in the period in question, Edna Harris, writing in the Chicago-based magazine Brush and Pencil, stated in 1899 that a cast which sounds very much like Klein's portrait bust, a figure in ruff, bedecked with curls, was the pride of many homes. And in the French context, Comini's key example is the artist Rosa Bonheur, who decorated her studio with a copy of the Klein mask. And the same is true of the writer Gabriele D'Annunzio and the dramatist August Strindberg, getting my tongue twisted. And it's likely that a reproduction of this same object was owned by the trade unionist and eventual Nobel Peace Prize winner, Léon Jouhaux, who placed it on the wall of his office in the headquarters of the Confédération Générale du Travail in Paris. All of these settings give characteristic testimony to the ubiquitous image of Beethoven in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, though especially in France, which, if it did not honour him with public monuments in marble, did so in the sanctuary of countless individual homes. That's another quote by Comini. Now, all of this, all of that I've just been saying, makes it highly probable that the object Wyndham Lewis wanted his readers to think of when they read about Bertha's plaster cast in tar was Klein's Mask of Beethoven. Not only because tar is set exclusively in Paris and is based on Lewis's time there in the early 1900s, but also because the fine details of the novel's phrasing suggest that it is Klein's mask specifically that Lewis has in mind. If anybody's panicking at this point, there is a rationale to this detective work. I'm going to get to something a bit meatier in a moment, but I want to convince you that these things are identifiable. After visiting 3 of his friends, to whom he complains about his engagement to Bertha, Tar goes to her apartment to eat his lunch. Tar was in the studio, or salon. It was a complete bourgeois bohemian interior. Green silk cloth and cushions of various vegetable and mineral shades covered everything in mildew blight. The cold, repulsive shades of islands of the dead, gigantic cypresses, grottos of Teutonic nymphs had installed themselves massively in this French flat. Purple metal and leather steadily dispensed with expensive objects. There was the plaster cast of Beethoven. Some people who frequented artistic circles get to dislike this face extremely. Brass jars from Normandy, a photograph of Mona Lisa. Tar could not look upon the Mona Lisa without a sinking feeling. Now, I think this passage is fascinating in all sorts of ways, but for the present purposes anyway, the most telling part of it is the clause, some people who have frequented artistic circles get to dislike this face extremely, in which Tar and Lewis seem briefly to overlap. The line's free indirect discourse, or feeling, mixes Tar's dislike of the copy of Beethoven's face with Lewis's antipathy, not only to the reductive use of Beethoven's face as a decorative trinket, but also perhaps to the familiar sight of the Klein image in so many studios, salons, and households. Bertha exasperates Tar, not only because she owns an object that as a copy is in his view a sign of her commonplaceness, but also due to the fact that the copy she owns refers to an original whose distinctiveness has been lessened through unending replications. James Joyce, for instance, knew not only that Beethoven figures in modern culture in an overdetermined way, it's too big, too many examples to comprehend almost, but also that that very figuring, that very appearance, has its own problematic nuances. And in the Cyclops chapter of Ulysses, where we learn that from the citizen's girdle hangs an image of Beethoven amid a row of sea stones, graven with rude yet striking art the tribal images of many Irish heroes and heroines of antiquity, an image of Beethoven stands out as a way to signal a wide range of cultural subtext, just as much as it represents a slip into cliché. The comically gargantuan list, which I haven't included for time purposes, of these tribal images in which Beethoven is named as Ludwig Beethoven, between various other characters, lowers the composer's cultural status. He is one half name among others. Yet the name's recognizability testifies to the way the very name, Beethoven, is conveniently, for Joyce, freighted with cultural memory. The convenience, however, cuts in 2 directions. As a strategy, and as evidence of the strategy as a strategy. So what Joyce is doing is drawing attention, I think, to the fact that people refer to Beethoven in certain ways. He's not just referring to Beethoven in the text. He's wanting us to notice that he is referring to Beethoven. And Beethoven's effacement in the list in which he appears signals the reference's mock heroic influences, along with its status as an all too familiar descriptive performance. There's very little of what the critic William S. Newman calls the Beethoven mystique in such a moment. Indeed, Beethoven's role as just one among many of the images hanging from the citizen's girdle tells us less about the composer's supposedly universal appeal and more about the capacity of his mystique to be received as, or more importantly, mistaken for, something meaningful. Now, to return to the Lewis scene that I've just quoted, the reference to the Plaster cast of Beethoven suggests that what is being satirized is the lamentable inevitability of the composer's face being used merely as an ornament. Grammatical style, in other words, bears out Lewis's critique. Paradoxically, the definite article signals the indefiniteness of the article being defined. And in the same way, the there in there was the plaster cast is not meant to be read as a reference to a specific place in the room. The cast is there rather than here, so to speak, but rather as an indication of Tars and Lewis's shared awareness of how, in an early 20th century bourgeois bohemian household as they see it, a Beethoven cast is obviously and disappointingly a thing one expects to see. Yet on these very same grounds, and accepting the weight of the definite article here, this is close reading, and perhaps its most extreme, the plaster cast of Beethoven, we might just as well read the plaster cast of Beethoven and the clause, some people who have frequented artistic circles get to dislike this face extremely, as references to one cast, or copy of a cast in particular. And the meaning of the passage thus changes slightly but significantly from an attack on bourgeois valuations of Beethoven reproductions in general to an attack on bourgeois valuations of a real identifiable sculpture. The bourgeoisie is Wyndham Lewis's enemy in all cases, particularly in this moment. Now, I've stressed the relevance of Klein's sculpture at some length to Lewis's novel, because it's likely, on the basis of the evidence in Tar, the novel, that Lewis misidentified Klein's work as a death mask. And Lewis was not alone in making that error, if you want to call it that. I've already noted that Rosa Bonheur, Gabriel D'Annunzio, and August Strindberg owned copies of Klein's mask. What I've not said is that all of these figures thought that it was also a death mask. And they were not alone in having this view. An article on the phrenology of the musical genius, printed in the April 1914 issue of the journal Letters and Art, reproduced an image of the Klein life mask, which identified as the death mask of Beethoven. And it crops up all over the place in literature of the period, that confusing of the two. And the muddle has implications for how we interpret Stephen Spender's late 1920s poem, Beethoven's Death Mask, which arguably takes as its point of departure the fact that by the 1920s, an obsessive interest, comparable to the interest in what is probably the most famous death mask of all, L'inconnue de la Seine, or the unknown woman of the Seine, had developed around an object, Beethoven's life mask, which was routinely mistaken for a memento mori. Klein's life mask achieved commonplaceness by virtue of its seemingly innumerable replications. But as I've already suggested, the commonplaceness generated an equally pervasive notion that the Beethovenian image Klein's mask popularized, itself widely misapprehended as a scowl, so if you remember a moment ago, it's not a scowl, he's uncomfortable. This was actually a representation of Beethoven in the pose of death. The real death mask, taken by Joseph Danhauser in 1827, is clearly, although this image is a little light to see it fully, is clearly a reproduction of a withered body, an impression amplified and distorted by the fact that the mask was cast after Beethoven's autopsy, during which his temporal bones were sawed out and carried away to facilitate an examination of the organs of hearing. So his face is very sunken. The difference between Klein's life mask and Danhauser's death mask is obvious enough if one knows that there are two masks to confuse, but by 1900 the distinction had generally slipped away. Klein's mask appeared to confirm what most people expected Beethoven's dying face to look like. in Beethoven's very recent biographer, Jan Swafford's words, fierce, bold, defiant, suffering, stormy, and, of course, tormented. The point is not that people mistook one mask for another, but that the fact that there are two masks was not widely appreciated. And as H.E. Krebil put it in 1898, in the Danhauser mask, the marks of the mutilations made by the surgeons for the purposes of the autopsy are too evident to make contemplation anything but sorrowful. So once you've seen it, you know what it is. All the same, throughout the 19th century, contemplation proceeded on the assumption that Klein's mask meant death. Danhauser's death mask has never been as well known as Klein's life mask, but it was given a boost by Ernst Benkard's Undying Faces, a collection of death masks, which appeared in German in 1927 and in English in 1929. This is the macabre part of this. The book includes plates of numerous historical figures, among them Lorenzo Medici, Oliver Cromwell, Isaac Newton, Alexander Pushkin, Georg Hegel, Gustav Flaubert, Richard Wagner, along with the nameless woman of the Seine, and two plates of the Danhauser death mask of Beethoven, as well as, more importantly, explicit confirmation that this mask and the Klein life mask are different objects. So once you've read this book, you cannot mistake them, ideally, but you shouldn't be able to. And as Benkard put it, in language which confirms the all-pervading influence of Klein upon the modern imagination, we can, quote, realize fully the startling change in Beethoven's face, which was caused not only by the 4 months of agonizing pain which preceded his death, but also by the post-mortem immediately following it, if we compare the Danhauser mask with the well-known life mask, of which casts are everywhere to be seen. No less a figure than Isaiah Berlin, reviewing this book, Benkard's book, in the Oxford Outlook, was convinced that death masks could express artistic and psychological truths about the dead subjects they portray. Berlin even went so far as to suggest that, quote, if a museum of such casts were established, it would give more delight, aesthetic or other, than portrait galleries or vie romancée, as seeming closer to reality. Beethoven's mask was for Berlin the high point, perhaps the most famous of all masks, and certainly the most indescribable. At any rate, it has never been done in prose, he said. After it, the rest appear little in comparison, though the 19th century abounds in striking faces, even more than the 18th. Now, Berlin's suggestion that the mask has never been done in prose brings us, finally, to Stephen Spender, to whom Berlin gave a copy of Benkard's book, due to their shared love of Beethoven. One of the results of this shared enthusiasm was not a prose work, but Spender's poem, as I've already mentioned, Beethoven's Death Mask, which was published by Basil Blackwell in 20 poems in 1930. Berlin's gift helped Spender make his poems specific, to render poetically his responses to an object with all the implications of a lifeless thing that seems somehow to be its subject, the lifeless yet still human figure behind its depicting. It also helped him to write more exactly about an often inaccurately identified sculpture, and so implicitly to make a claim for the distinctiveness of the Danhauser death mask amid the innumerable reproductions of Klein's mask, with which it was often confused. For Spender, this mattered because it said something about our collective attitude to our cultural forebears, about our understanding of a figure who looms so large in our history as to be rendered all but invisible by the processes of mismemory. Yet it also forced Spender to confront the fact that writing about one art object, a sculpture, in the terms of another, a poem, the technique known as ekphrasis, can conceal as much as it uncovers. Now, I've long thought this to be a particularly mysterious technique, and one of the most famous literary examples by Keats opens as follows. Thou still unravished bride of quietness, thou foster child of silence and slow time, sylvan historian, who canst thus express a flowering tale more sweetly than our rhyme. And on it goes. Now, the speaker of this poem addresses the urn in a manner that immediately hands over authority to it, thus raising the question of why it is that a poem is needed to represent it in the first place. Surely the best thing to do would simply be to invite audiences to look at the sorts of materials upon which Keats based the poem, which included the Townley vase at the British Museum. If the urn, a sylvan historian, can express things more sweetly than the poem's rhyme, as we are told it is able to, then one wonders why the poet tries to do what we are told cannot be done, to go one better than the urn, in effect, to outdo the urn in telling a flowering tale. And yet we can see that the poetic form, if you like Keats, that is, works against this claim. We can see that the act of creating a poem concerned with the impossibility of rendering beauty is itself exquisite, thereby calling into question, in a clever reversal, the very thing it appears to deny, or that it announces to be unmanageable. Now, Spender's goal, in part, was to do what Berlin said had not been done, which was to do, in a quote, the Danhauser death mask in language. Now, I'm just going to read you the poem so that you're familiar with it. Beethoven's Death Mask. I imagine him still with heavy brow, huge, black, with bent head and falling hair. He ploughs the landscape. His face is this hanging mask transfigured, this mask of death which the white lights make stare. I see the thick hands clasped, the scarecrow coat, the light strike upwards at the holes for eyes, the beast squat in that mouth whose opening is the hollow opening of an organ pipe. There the wind sings and the harsh longing cries. He moves across my vision like a ship. What else is iron but he? The fields divide and, heaving, are changing waters of the sea. He is prisoned, masked, shut off from being. Life, like a fountain, he sees leap outside. Yet, in that head, there twists the roaring cloud and coils as in a shell the roaring wave. The damp leaves whisper, bending to the rain. The April rises in him, chokes his lungs, and climbs the torturing passages of his brain. Then the drums move away, the distance shows. Now cloud-hid peaks are bared. The mystic one horizon's haze, as the blue incense, heaven. Peace. Peace. Then splitting skull and dream there comes blotting our lights, the trumpeter, the sun. Now, this poem is also concerned with the doublings of language by which Keats was so fascinated. Spender's poem is a poem as much about a specified object, a death mask, as it is about the impressionistic reactions of the subject witnessing it. As the poem progresses, we learn that the lyrical subject is moved to imagine Beethoven in life, or in an idealized life, by the sight of the mask, a disturbing object that seems uncannily to stare at its perceivers. Such imagining forces the subject of the poem to reflect on the distance between the towering iron creator of so many musical masterpieces and the small, fragile face shut off from being before him. Such contemplation, in turn, leads to epiphany, to a point of revelation. As the subject deliberates the material fixity, the material density of the death mask, nature seems to stir within it. In that head there twists the roaring cloud, we are told, and coils as in a shell the roaring wave. Next, it seems that Beethoven, even in this passive, disintegrated form, makes perceptible a heavenly space where there comes, blotting our lights, the trumpeter, the sun. And so the poem links the prosaicness, or the phenomenology of the death mask, to an ideal realm of peace beyond it, where the symbolic and rhythmic tensions of the preceding lines fall away. And you can see it being literalized there through the typography. There's an ellipsis, two ellipses. Part of the poem's meaning seems to be that in this context, the new is not possible without the old. The first line, I imagine him still with heavy brow, refers us back to the frowning and scowling Beethoven associated with his 19th century depictions, just as the second line, huge, black, with bent head and falling hair, alludes, probably, to the image of Beethoven enshrined in sculptures like Waddell's portrait bust of the composer, which you've seen already. Likewise, a reference to his scarecrow coat evokes Joseph Daniel Böhm's famous drawing of Beethoven walking, seen from the back. Intentionally or not, these gestures away from Danhauser's mask highlight the difficulty of imagining Beethoven in terms that do not draw on prior representations. It's very difficult to talk about Beethoven originally, put simply. Spender's poem does not try to circumvent the problem diagnosed by Alfred Einstein, not the scientist, the fact that the human characteristics or true visage of the great men of the past gradually become hidden behind an idealized mask of legend, to the extent that the further removed a personality in point of time, the more it becomes a myth. Rather, the poem, tries to find a new space for impressions of Beethoven amid the idealizing masks of his own iconographic legacy. Beethoven's Death Mask, the poem, is, in other words, partly an act of resistance, a fresh instance of creativity amid the degradations of the Beethoven culture industry. But it also suggests that in the wake of so many 19th and early 20th century depictions of Beethoven, there can be no return to some unmediated or unanticipated view of a composer inextricably bound up with the rhetorical and visual impressions of others. And there's an analogy here with the fact that masks, the physical objects, are not unerringly faithful copies of the faces they seem exactly to duplicate. An anonymous English sculptor, quoted by W. Barclay Squire in his essay on Beethoven's appearance for the April 1927 volume of Music and Letters, so the centenary issue of Beethoven, made exactly this point in relation to life masks, though the same provisos hold for death masks. The wet, heavy plaster laid over the face in a reclining position depresses very slightly the soft parts of the flesh, leaving, where the bone is subcutaneous, prominences greater than appear in the actual face in life. The eyes appear at best as in sleep, on account of the oiled tissue paper with which the lids and lashes must be covered, this process being applied also to the eyebrows, if bushy, and impossible of subjugation by oil alone, as I imagine Beethoven's to have been. You can sense there also the workings of myth coming back into even this seemingly objective description. Also, the whole head cannot be reproduced, and by stopping at the point where the hair springs above the forehead, a quite erroneous impression may be produced, owing to the implication of a different proportion of forehead to cranium. This account allows us to see that there is a difference between the details of a face and a face as detailed in a cast, which approximates, rather than exactly transcribes, a face or a physiognomy, an inexactness that just keeps on going the further one gets from the original face. The difference between the Klein life mask, for instance, as you can see here, and the Klein portrait bust, which was based on the mask, is the difference between quasi-life-likeness and likeness to life as it is newly imagined by its creator. What I'm suggesting is that there is a link between the way a death mask appears to faithfully register a face on the one hand, and Spender's registering of Beethoven's death mask on the other. For what Spender's poem does not suggest is that some simplistically authentic, genuine access to the reality of what Beethoven looked like is possible, even by looking at a mask which seems to capture his likeness. The transfigured face of the composer caught in the mask reflects the transfigured image of the mask caught in the poem. Both transfigurations, both representations, mirroring the inevitable distancing of Beethoven by the forms of the media through which so many have formed an image of him. Put another way, inasmuch as it is an instance of what Jean-Luc Nancy, the philosopher, describes in an extraordinary discussion of death masks and photographs, a casting of a presence fleeing into absence. Spender's poem itself enacts the distance between Beethoven and the death mask that gives the poem its focus. It is itself a metaphor for the way a death mask distorts, even as it seems faithfully to reproduce a face. And all of this ties into a suggestion in the poem that there is no right or objective way in which Beethoven's significance can be construed. From its outset, beginning with its very first word, I, the poem foregrounds the subjective impressions of its speaker, its lyrical subject, thereby valuing an angled perspective, a subjective perspective, on a cultural presence, Beethoven, whose innumerable meanings had by the early 20th century already been formulated and reformulated in all sorts of contexts many times over. So, where has all of this got us? I want to conclude by suggesting that writers don't just refer to Beethoven portrait sculptures because they do or don't like them, though they do and they don't, depending, but rather because their valuations of Beethoven were bound up with their sense of how his image was received in the wider culture. Put another way, they cared about and were interested in the formation and life of ideas about Beethoven, in this instance with regard to the literally material processing of ideas as sculpture. The fact that they made sculptures of this sort part of their literature, means that they wanted to foreground their role in different aspects and tendencies of the modern world. And tonight I've concentrated on a few of those roles, relating them to questions related to bourgeois identity, artistic reproduction, and the link between art and selfhood. But I've barely scratched the surface of how diversely Beethoven figures in literature across the early 20th century more generally. Another time, perhaps. Following the increasing popularity of plaster casts in the early modern period among artists, humanists, and cultural and commercial nobility, during the 1800s, the production of plaster cast busts of famous men, such as Goethe and Beethoven, developed industrial dimensions. Those who recognized the commercial imperatives behind such objects knew that their popularity made them an easy object of derision, particularly when they were venerated by those who fell beneath their high measure of the proper place of Beethoven's life and music in modern culture. And you can read more about that in an excellent book by Rune Fredriksson and Eckhart Marchand called Plaster Casts, making, collecting, and displaying from classical antiquity to the present. This interest that Ernst Benkard, the book I showed you earlier, really gets going with Beethoven anyway, continues. Lewis, Richardson, Wells, and Spender, among others, knew that they could be integrated with varying degrees of symbolism into narrative, that they could include these works in their literature in meaningful ways. They also knew that that integrating itself showed how the Beethovenian portrait, and especially the portrait sculpture, could be magnificent as much as it could become mundane. Thank you. Of course, yes.
Do you want to come and sit down?
Yes.
So thank you very much indeed. There is opportunity now for questions or comments from members of the audience. If you do want to ask a question, make a comment, could you raise your hand and a microphone will be brought to you. You use it by holding it fairly close to your mouth, sort of ice cream cone distance. So are there people who want to ask questions, make a comment? Not so far. Okay. Yes, thank you. Up front. It's just coming.
Thank you. Would we have been having this lecture and this discussion if, as many schools of thought believe, Beethoven hadn't merely been a better publicist than other musicians of his time?
Yes. One of the relationships that I am having to navigate, to solve, to work through in some sense in the wider project that this belongs to is the relationship between Wagner and Beethoven, and actually the image of Beethoven is given a huge boost by Wagner in all sorts of ways. In one primary way, as an act of resistance, as an act of moving away from him. So I think, in a sense, you might extend the question and say, would we be having this discussion not only if Beethoven had been other than he was, but also if Wagner had not also been other than he was too? I mean, that's interesting because it raises the question of the related point, as I see it, is why these writers are doing what they're doing at all. I mean, why are they fixating on Beethoven? Because if you mention Beethoven, people sit to attention. This is one of the things that I was alluding to early in the talk when I said that you, as a sort of digger for evidence in this sphere, you have to be careful that what you're finding is in fact, or you have to sort of think carefully about whether what you're finding in fact means anything, or if it's just a sort of mark of cultural esteem. And often it's that. It's often people saying, this view, vista, experience, whatever it is, reminded me of the sounds of Beethoven's Ninth. The sounds of Beethoven's Ninth. There's a wonderful example of that in H.G. Wells, actually, in his novel Tono Bungay. In Wells's case, I think he's doing it to make a point about that thing, about that process. But I'm sure in the wider culture, and you can find this, Google, for instance, is a marvelous tool, because you can just put in Beethoven and you get all sorts of things that you would never in any human life be able to find manually or by working through the archives fully. There are many more references to Beethoven, I think, where it's that sense of a cultural marker or sign rather than a proper engagement with it is happening. So in that, I'm not sure if that really answers your question, but I think the question itself is a sign of that very process of the superficiality of potential embodiments of Beethoven as a figure or as a musician in the literature of the time. The fact that we're able to recognise it and the fact that you're able to ask it shows that we now are aware of that in a quite interesting, critical way, I think. So thank you.
Thank you. Yes, please, even further forward. Second row.
My question is, I'm not sure if it's a fair question. You talk about the mask and top of sculpture. So to a certain extent, it's a recreation, artistic recreation or portrait, painting. Nowadays, in the modern world where people take selfie and, everything is so digitalized and photographs and stuff, do you think that we have lost this kind of ambiguous materials that foster and cultivate this kind of sort of romantic interpretation? So do you think that we will still have such a talk like today in, say, 100 years?
Again, I hope so. The fact that you mentioned selfies, which made me think of iPhones and, smartphones in general, and sort of taking photographs of these things. There is a Twitter feed devoted to the Beethoven bust. There is a. I'm not sure who runs it, but some clever clog somewhere in London has a Beethoven bust feed, and it crops up all over the place. So in that sense, we're already there, I think. The technology is embodying the very thing that you're asking about. I suppose the way I would answer that is to say that, in a sense, the process is already underway in the period I'm looking at. The writers that are engaging with these ideas of mediation, reproducibility, the possibility of an original copy as opposed to an original, because they're already skeptical about the access to the original. They're already dealing with those issues, and that's it's an industrial problem almost, because it's no longer enough to know that there's a Beethoven bust. You have to own it, and you have to own it by having a copy. Actually, there was a quotation which didn't make it into this by the music critic W.J. Turner, who went to Vienna in 1927 and talks about exactly this. He's walking around Vienna going, "Oh, all this paraphernalia that I'm surrounded by." He says, if people who were buying this stuff had only gone 2 blocks around the corner, they could have seen the original sculpture. But that's not why they're there. They're there to buy the copy because they want the souvenir, and that's really what the heart of this is about. What the implications of that are for the way literature and art more generally might engage with it. Because in a sense, if you're depicting, as Balestrieri does in that painting that I showed you, if you have a mask in the painting, you're furthering the problem if you view it in a skeptical way or a cynical way. What is the status of the art object in those situations? It's hard to resist the idea that it's just an unending sort of box within a box within a box within a box of copies, because that's what it is in some sense. Thank you.
Good. Yes. There.
One thing with it, the face is an extremely dynamic feature. It's never the same. One thing you didn't mention was with death mask, which also distorts them, is the muscles, whether it's embalmed or whether it's rigor mortis, are in a state they are never in life.
Yes.
And this alters the whole. And with a dynamic feature, can any image ever give us a true impression of what it was originally?
Well, I mean, for Spender, I think the poem, Spender's poem, Beethoven's Death Mask, is sort of fascinated by that question in a sense, because it's making a claim about some truth of Beethoven that is visible to us in death as opposed to life. So in the moment of non-activity, in the capturing of him as something limp and lifeless, at his most non-Beethovenian almost, at the precise moment where he ceases to be who he is, that's when you write the poem. At least Spender, does. I mean, it's obviously a retrospective poem, but the subject suggests that. And that's fascinating. The discussion by Nancy that I referred to about death masks and photography is concerned with exactly this. What do you capture in a mask? Do you, in fact, capture, as we think of film frames, do you capture a frame of someone's motion or life in more general terms? Or do you actually, if done well, capture something that you cannot be captured in any other way, and in that sense reveal the truth of that subject, whatever that might be? I don't know. I don't really have an answer. But I think the irony is important to think about, because it's such an unpromising topic almost for a poem, a death mask. And a talk. But there we go.
But fascinating nonetheless, yes. More questions, comments? Yes, please, front row. Thanks, Erin.
Thanks, Nathan, for a really great talk that I've enjoyed, and I want to ask you lots more questions about afterwards. I was wondering about another function of these, the sort of way that the bust becomes ubiquitous here. And I was wondering if there's something about the function that relates to music as a kind of visceral, as a form that needs to be experienced through performance. So I suppose my question is, I'm wondering if there's a sense also in which having these busts, having these mass-produced busts, also they act as a kind of mnemonic. They act almost as a way of, as a kind of almost before the technology of sort of mechanically reproduced music exists. Do they almost act as a kind of, oh, and this makes me think of some of Beethoven's music as well? Do you think there's that element to it as well?
Yeah, I do. I mean, one of the key things that I did not mention, purely just space concerns, is the way that busts are used in a non-critical way by people. They're often used as a sign of respect on a wall. Many composers have used busts and masks for exactly that reason. Liszt, for instance, is a very famous example of somebody who had the death mask of Beethoven on his wall, and knew that it was a death mask. And if you dig deeply enough, you can find these nuances. But interestingly, again, Liszt with the death mask, as opposed to the life mask. I think, yes, in the sense that it's a shorthand of some sort to some greater experience. The player piano kind of has a similar but different function as a sort of vehicle to get to music through other means. I think the way I'm reading it and the way I presented the bust and the mask as an ornament to you is one of mechanically attenuated or lessened art. It still, nevertheless, may be valuable to people. It's just in the examples that I've found in the literature I'm interested in, it almost always appears as something to be skeptical about or to be distrusting of. So in that sense, I don't think I'm misrepresenting the literature, but certainly in the wider... it goes back really to an opposition, we were talking about this earlier. The modernists see mass-produced art as a problem. Those who enjoy mass-produced art don't see it as a problem. And why should they? Why should anybody? Why should anybody not like mass-produced things? We all are wearing mass-produced things, by and large. We can't get through. I don't know. Who knows? People may be wearing their own clothes. Who knows? But we can't get by without the mass-produced. So to go automatically to the claim that mass production is a problem is too simplistic. But I think that the modernists make that move with varying degrees of awareness of it. So yes, I think yes, in the sense that you're right, there is this mnemonic idea, but it's sort of bound up with that as a negative, and a sort of inescapably so.
Presumably those people who had busts of Beethoven as a furnishing accessory, to indicate their culturedness, would have preferred the bust to be a death mask, because that's more romantic.
Yes.
And that will have perpetrated the idea that it is a death mask.
Well, this is, I mean, thinking through this has sent me mad on a few occasions, because you start to doubt whether what you're looking at is in fact what you think you're looking at. And as I was reading it out, I was thinking, I hope I've got this right, because I have, for hours and hours and hours looked at this and gone to the sources, and I know that the mask is the right way around. But at the same time, you think it's the ease of the legend, really. Mm-hmm. Beethoven comes preloaded with a certain sense of who it is that you imagine him to have been, and we surrender to it. The same goes for all sorts of composers, But Beethoven, I think, is a privileged case by virtue of how he has been allowed to develop that reputation and that aura that goes with it. I mean, again, and something else that I haven't really talked about is the aura of these objects. They seem to capture something of the subject. If you go, actually, this summer, I saw quite a few portrait busts in various museums, and it's something magnificent about witnessing them, because you imagine that you're in the in the presence of the person that it captures. At least I do. And it's hard almost not to, because the power of it is there. And Beethoven, not only that, but there's the music as well, which is seemingly signaled through it. There's a wide, I mean, I haven't really shown you the full variety of the various portrait busts that are in existence and have been made. There are many, 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 many of them, along with their reproductions.
So would I be right in guessing that you did not get to dislike this face extremely?
No. Yes. No, it's... no, I can still look at the face and be happy that it's there.
Good. Yes, please, here, a few rows back.
One of the first slides you put up showed the Beethoven Frieze in Vienna, with the sculpture of Beethoven that was meant to be at the center of that room, yet you didn't speak about it.
No, I realize that.
I mean, how do you see that? I mean, that's a fantastic, not that I've seen the original, but it's a tremendously powerful concept and setup.
Yes. I was in Boston in November, and I turned a corner in the Museum of Fine Arts there, and there was a reproduction of the torso. And I was taken aback, because only an hour before I'd been working on a different thing related to this. And I thought, oh, here it is. And I had something of the sense of what it must have been like to witness that full-size sculpture, which, in addition to the Klimt paintings that accompanied it. As far as I've been able to determine, there's no literary interaction with that object, but there are plenty of discussions of it. It's, for me, actually, this is important for a scene in a novel that I haven't discussed, which is E.M. Forster's Howard's End. The big scene, the big famous scene, the fifth, it's all mentioned all the time in the literature, the critical literature, of the performance of Beethoven's Fifth. And one of the first words, adjectives that's used to describe the sound that they hear, the sublime noise of Beethoven's Fifth. Something that I am convinced is going on there is that Forster is signaling not only the more intangible sense of sublimity, something that is aesthetically powerful and it's sort of overwhelmingly so, but also that he's referring to things of the sort that image generated, which was a sense of the immediate sublimity, the sort of overpowering sense of Beethoven as a cultural presence, not just as a god as he's depicted there. As a sort of literal god as well as a musical one, but also of a commanding sort of figure that you can't ignore. And that, I think, creeps into literature in other ways, even if it's not directly about it. I mean, actually, in Tar, Lewis has one of his characters refer to Klinger's works by Klinger negatively. So there is a sense, but it's not in relation to that sculpture. It's because it's to do with small sort of objects. So I'm not sure if there were small reproductions of that. I haven't actually ascertained that as yet. It hasn't occurred to me to do that. There might be. But it's a fascinating work, that one, anyway. It's very, very powerful. So thank you for reminding me.
Any other questions or comments? No. Okay. Well, thank you very much indeed for a fascinating talk covering a very interesting combination of subjects, at least to a scientist, a most unusual combination of subjects.
Thank you for having me.
And making it very clear and extremely interesting.
Thank you.
Can I ask you to return your thanks to our speaker? It's fascinating. Thank you very much
No,
indeed.
thank you for
Really
letting me
good.
speak.
Oh, it's